Everybody. Good morning, and thank you for being here today, and thank you for the opportunity for us to share our presentation with you guys. My name is Clinton Hausman, and these are my colleagues, Michael Shames and Bradley Waddell. The three of us are students at Tufts University, and we came up with the idea for this project in Andy Andre's class on sabermetrics that we took last fall. So we've noticed over the last few years, as you can see by this graph right here, that shifting between the 2010 and 2018 season has increased by over 1,000%. And this began with more extreme pull hitters, but has expanded to a lot more types of hitters, and has been widely used by every team in the league. So we wanted to take this a step further, and we wanted to look to optimize how we can shift fielders based on an individual's given batted ball data. So Michael's going to take over and explain a little bit how we are going to go about doing that.
Yeah, so initially with this problem, when faced with this shift problem, one would think that a good way to go about this would be to look at the outcome of each batted ball. However, we had to sort of circumvent this problem because we faced the problem of endogeneity, where each outcome is dependent on the location of the fielder, and we don't necessarily have this data publicly available. So we had to sort of circumvent this problem. For this project, we used Baseball Savant's HCX and HCY, which we interpreted as coordinates on the baseball field, and where it tells us where the ball was fielded on the baseball field. So mathematically, the field consists of an infinite number of points, and in order to turn this into an optimization problem, we wanted to discretize the field. So we separated the field into 96 segments, 12 by 8. The reason we chose 98 was more a qualitative analysis where we evaluated the trade-off between having as many segments as possible, because we want this model to be very nuanced and we want it to be robust, but at the same time we want to make sure that in each segment there's a reasonable sample size of batted balls for each segment. So we also decided to focus only on situations where there were no runners on base, as to sort of simplify the problem for us, because when there's runner on base, situational constraints arise. For instance, if there's a runner on first base, there has to be either the second base or shortstop close to second base in order to defend against the possibility of a stolen base. So yeah, so in order to turn this into a problem we could deal with, we were thinking about it in terms of what contribution can a defender in one segment have. Oh no. Don't know what happened. Oh, it's back up. Okay. So we wanted to know what contribution one defender can have in one segment to a batted ball in another segment. So we decided on this new goal where we were going to pick the 7 segments. So that's segments for non-pitcher, non-catcher fielders with the highest aggregate contribution score. So that's maximizing the defensive contribution for a team based on a given hitter's batted ball data. So we did this goal for 3 players. We chose Brian Dozier because he's an extreme power pull hitter, and we wanted to see what our model would look like for a player with such extreme statistics, as well as Christian Yelich, who's the reigning NL MVP, but he's more of a balanced hitter, as well as still displaying that power. And we also want to look at Mike Trout because, well, who doesn't want to know how to shift Mike Trout? So in order to look at this problem further, sorry, I'm having trouble here. So we wanted to look more into what exactly this coordinate information conveys to us. So we used some trigonometry to calculate information about where or how the distance between segments, so how to get from one segment to another, as well as the angle at which a fielder would have to run between segments. So we split this problem up into 4 components, 2 of which were fielder independent measures and 2 were fielder dependent. The 4 components were the density, so the spray chart of the ball, how bad that ball was hit, so the severity, and then the 2 fielder dependent measures were the fielder range as well as the fielder angle to the ball. So the first measure was the fielder independent measure, batted ball density. And this is what you typically think of when you think of a shift. So when you think about optimizing a shift, you want to know exactly where the balls are being hit on the field. So that's what this is attempting to get at. So we're looking at so we calculated the percentage of balls hit in each segment, and that gives us sort of a heat map based on the batted ball density. As you can see here, we have the density heat map for Christian Yelich. And one thing you may notice is there's sort of this pocket of balls. There's this pocket of space past the infield where there are no batted balls. And the reason for this is because the fielders are fielding the ball in front of that area. And remember, HCX and HCY tell us where the ball was fielded.
So the second fielder independent measure that we looked at was how bad are those balls for the defense and what kind of damage could they do to the defense. So we wanted this to be intrinsically not tied to outcomes, as we mentioned the endogeneity problem earlier with the fielder positions. So for this, we considered two different factors, which were exit velocity and launch angle. So in essence, we were trying to get at with these two things, how hard was the ball hit, which makes it harder hit balls are harder to make a play on, or pose another way of framing that is they pose a bigger detriment to the defense in terms of like a runs allowed kind of capacity. And then also the launch angle, which isn't a perfect way of incorporating some of the physics involved with how long a player has to react to the ball. But our thoughts were that a ball that's hit very high or a ball that's hit straight into the ground is not going to be good, and we'll go through that analysis that we did. So first, we fit a polynomial relationship for the exit velocity to the non-home run hit percent, which is this graph you see here. And for that relationship, we were thinking that this would be a good measure of how bad a ball is for the defense. In that, we're kind of assuming that we're collapsing everything onto one dimension because the spatial component isn't necessarily there. For that, like I said, and I want to stress, we considered non-home run hits. And this is the same analysis that we did for the launch angle. So this was a little bit more of a nuanced problem in that it didn't fit necessarily well to any one polynomial, so we defined two piecewise polynomials, or one piecewise polynomial, removing some of that noise that you see over there on the left. For this, what we did is we did a cosine transformation. So when you think of the launch angle, you think of the plane at which the ball is hit, or the plane at which the ball would be evenly hit, and then 90 degrees would be straight up, and negative 90 degrees would be straight down. So in order to incorporate, that nuance with the launch angle, we made the attribution that a ball hit on a straight line would be the worst for the defense. And seeing as we're considering non-home runs, this is, not so weak of an assumption. So here, we can see these severity scores compiled for Christian Yelich, one of our subjects. The most important thing to note, I would say, is that it seems like it has, it fairly well goes along with our intuition, where you see like the darker red dots tend to be farther out. Those are some things that would pose more of a detriment and to the defense, and those that are more contained to the infield, those pose less of a detriment to the defense, which was definitely a good sign. The way we compiled these two measures, the launch angle and the exit velocity, was through multiplying them so that we could get an interaction between the two, because we want to consider them both together, not in their separate entities. So moving on to the to the play distance matrix, which was our third component, and fielder dependent, the first of our fielder dependent measures. We really broke this down into two different subparts, which were the range of a fielder, or like how far could a fielder run from one segment to another to make a play, and then also what was the angle at which a fielder has to run to make that play. So for this context, for every individual segment, using the trigonometric formulas that Michael showed earlier, we were able to find the distance between any two segments, and we were also able to find this angle. So yeah, So this also is the fourth component, the dependent measure, which is the angle matrix. And for this, we were able to thankfully have a reference from MLB.com, which showed a study that the most difficult play for outfielders to make was to be running in the back 60 degrees, so any other play would not necessarily have an effect on the fielder's ability, any other angle would not necessarily have an effect on the player's ability to make the play. And for this, we also did a cosine transformation where running straight back would be the most difficult for the fielder, and then running elsewhere would be diminishingly difficult. One more thing to mention about the play distance matrix is that we added a couple constraints in here, in that a player can't necessarily have a contribution from one segment to the other side of the field. So we included a cap on that contribution. So beyond, I think it was roughly 100 feet, a player couldn't have any contribution in any other segments. And then additionally, that contribution is diminishing with distance. So we used an inverse squared distance metric to get at that, so we could diminish the contribution in the other segments. So now that we have the four components, both fielder independent and dependent, we were able to, it's not that important, but we were able to multiply these together, and that would give an interaction between the fielder independent and fielder dependent, and we could move on to the problem of optimization. So our goal was to maximize the total defensive contribution by picking 7 segments, and we used an optimization algorithm that we created for this, but we imposed a few constraints, which were the first base constraint, which essentially you need to have someone in the realm of first base. We confined that to a few small segments over there, and then we also picked the other ones, and we tried to mitigate the problem of overlapping contributions, where if you place one player in one segment and you place another player in the segment right next to it, they're going to have overlapping contributions to the play, which is not necessarily a benefit to the manager or to the defensive output. So now Michael's going to take you guys through some of the results.
Yeah, so now to get to the more fun part, we get to present our results for our 3 subjects, which, as we mentioned, were Mike Trout, Christian Yelich, and Brian Dozier. So hopefully this can show up. Yeah, so this is our results for Mike Trout. So as you can see, Mike Trout is more of a pull hitter, so it would make sense that we have more fielders shifted towards the left side of the field. You will mention there is one fielder who seems to be more at the warning track or even at the wall, which sort of seems to signify that Mike Trout hits a lot of balls that far. Also, you may notice that we have 2 fielders stacked on the third base line. This was a problem we ran into a little bit, that we look in further modifications to our model, we would look to combat this issue of fielders being stacked on top of each other, because realistically, one fielder would be able to cover a lot of balls in both of those areas. Also, you may notice there's a player positioned near the pitcher's mound, which also doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because a pitcher would be able to field balls there. So in the future, we would look to add a constraint around the pitcher's mound. So now our next result, Christian Yelich. As we mentioned before, Christian Yelich was more of a balanced hitter. So one would expect less of a shift towards one side of the field or the other. You will also notice that we sort of have 4 pseudo outfielders. And again, we ran into this stacking problem. And you also notice in all of our results, we have as Bradley mentioned, we have the constraint around first base, as a fielder needs to be placed there. To get to our last result, Brian Dozier. This one was our more extreme one. When we were looking at Brian Dozier, we wanted a player who was an extreme pull hitter, and that really did come across in our results. As you can see here, if it shows up, on the left side of the field, on the third baseline, there's 3 defenders stacked, which again was that same problem. But it really sort of emphasizes the point that he's an extreme pull hitter. And then also, sort of interestingly, we have a fielder more in right center field, deep right center field, which is sort of an interesting result, that a fielder could have a huge contribution by being placed there. So that brings us into some of our limitations and assumptions. So the first one was the limited data we had. So the exit velocity and launch angle data wasn't publicly available until 2015, and the coordinates weren't available until 2014. So we were working with a limited sample, although this wasn't as big of an issue because we did have all 3 of these players have played full seasons in all those years, pretty much full seasons. The bigger issue that we ran into was not having the location of fielder data. So this is important because if we had this data, we'd be able to look at the outcomes themselves and how they relate to where the fielders are being placed on the field. Instead, we sort of ran into this outcome bias problem where even in our fielder independent measures, each batted ball was dependent on where the fielders were located, and that we looked at a standard alignment of like fielders. So there's outcome bias there. Also, we had this optimization bias towards the infield problem where we saw this especially in our early iterations of the model where density scores seemed to be really highly emphasized, and we had a lot of infielders. But we attempted to fix that in later modifications. And then throwing constraints. So one thing you may have noticed with the guys positioned more sort of shallow outfield, our model seems to make the assumption that given a ground ball there, the fielder could successfully throw out the base runner at first base every time, which in reality we know isn't necessarily the case. So we would look to fix this in the future. And then with HCX and HCY, we sort of had contrived meaning out of these coordinates and how they related to the baseball field. And then the last thing was we assumed that for every segment, the ball was placed in the center of each segment, and therefore, when we were positioning fielders, the fielder is positioned at the centroid of each segment. So Clinton will take you to some of our future modifications and improvements to our model.
Thank you, Michael. So yeah, just to summarize, we do have plans to improve this in the future, and the best way to do that would be with the release of fielder location data, both at the start of play and at the end of play, which would allow us to sort of not have to take this approach with the contribution score that doesn't necessarily have any intrinsic value, and we could look at it in an outcome-oriented approach and quantify it based on amount of runs saved or amount of bases saved. We also would like to optimize positioning for more types of hitters. So like maybe a contact hitter or other like a lefty pull hitter, for example, to see how what our model would think for them. And we also would like to make this a little bit more useful in an in-game situation by accounting for fielder skill instead of just assuming that every fielder is a generic average quality player. And then we could take into account their speed and their probability of making a catch, which would make it a little bit more useful in an in-game situation based on an opponent, such as like in a high leverage situation where this would most likely be used. Oops. And we just wanted to thank Andy Andres, and Morris Greenberg, who Andy's here, right here, and Morris couldn't be here today, but they were very important to us in guiding us through this project in our class. And we are open to any questions if people have them.
Thank you.
So if I'm interpreting correctly, the question was how would we incorporate and how would our model respond to information that if there was a warning track play that the catch probability goes down. Is that correct? So for the first part of that, I would say that's another level of nuance that we could definitely include in the model and for those segments, right? So like for each of those segments, perhaps we could have a lower weighting on those in the final row, or in maybe even like if there was some information that that probability was to decrease like over the course of the field or something like that, we could also incorporate that into the model. As far as for now, the model is saying where can you find the greatest contribution. So if we were to incorporate that probability, it would definitely be a lower contribution in that segment or in the set of segments. Yeah, thank you. That's a good suggestion.
Yeah, and just to add, I think something that would be really helpful too, especially sort of as Clinton was mentioning, if we're looking for specific teams' fielders, then we can really incorporate that specific fielder's range. So like if we're looking at the Red Sox, we can look how far can Jackie Bradley Jr. run, or how far can Xander Bogaerts throw the ball, and how successfully can he throw a base runner out, which would help us with figuring out exactly where on the field he could field a ground ball and how likely he is from that position to throw the runner out at first base. So, yeah, thank you.
I may have missed something that you said, but was that based on optimizing for getting the batter out, or does it also include optimizing holding them to the fewest number of bases on div?
So the whole point of the contribution score was to be outcome independent, so it wouldn't necessarily reflect the number of bases because those are biased necessarily. And so to your question, the optimization was to maximize the total contribution across all of the segments. So if the manager wanted to cover all of the or maximize his coverage of all of the possible contribution, that's what he would do.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.